Okay, so today I'm going to be having two separate hybrids go toe-to-toe against each other. The hybrids in question here are Tiamatosaurus, a hybrid I myself created, and the strongest hybrid out of the engine hybrid trio of mine, and Samson, Madly Metazoic's hybrid. These two are both probably some of the largest hybrids within the current hybrid competition or hybrid war, whatever you want to call it, even though Tiamatosaurus is technically disqualified because he has human DNA. I don't really care about that, but they were created for more or less the hype of the whole hybrid war going on. Anyways, the reason they're going to be going head to head against each other is that I'm going to be doing this with all three engine hybrid dinosaurs. I'm going to do Tiamatosaurus first. Originally I planned to do his match last, but upon looking into it more, I realized this was one of the fights that would be quicker. In other words, the animation wouldn't take much time. That's not to say it's not a close fight or it's extremely one-sided either. It's more or less that both of these guys, if they were to kill the other one, would do so fairly quickly, as it would really only take one good hit on either party to bring the other down, mainly due to how big these guys are and how big their weapons are as a result. Before I really get into talking about which one of these two would most likely win a 1v1 fight, I am going to specify that this video is a little different than the normal content on my channel, as typically I take a more power scaling based approach to my videos, looking at things as a power scaler for the most part, unless I'm doing animated series or something like that, in which case it's an animation, so that doesn't really matter all too much, as I'm making the character, so no one's going to really question the power scaling if I'm the one in charge of the whole thing. Unless it's a Godzilla fight animation, then I usually do power scaling before I do it, but ignoring that, this isn't going to be a video looked at through the standard power scaling lens. It's going to be looked at in a very similar way to the monster face-offs that Goji Center does, or the verse battles that the Overseer does, where it's taking a more realistic approach to fictional creatures. Typically I'd have problems with this, as two creatures from different verses will by default have very different scaling, but I'm doing this for three major reasons. One, Madly Mesozoic himself has made his opinions on power scaling very apparent, and he's definitely not a fan, to put it lightly. I know that from personal experience and a conversation I've had with him in his own comment section. Guy doesn't like that. So if he was to see his little mammoth getting power scaled, he'd probably be pretty mad, or at the very least would probably have something to say about it. So I'm just not going to do that for Samson for that reason. Also, I'm trying to keep these two characters in the same type of video that they'd be used to. My video on the original hybrid trio I did, the one that Tiamatosaurus would have been introduced in, did take a kind of more realistic approach to it than my standard videos did. And obviously Samson was from a channel that values realism over power scaling for fictional creatures, so it would feel more consistent to have them in this type of lens over a power scaling one. And the other reason is that both of these guys are based in the Jurassic Park / Jurassic World universe, so they'd already have a lot of the same scaling by default, and they're pretty much stronger than almost anything in the verse just already, so it's not like them upscaling something that the other one hasn't had proof of upscaling would help much, as realistically both of these guys are well above something like the Giga and the Indominus. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the whole breakdown and all that. What I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to break down which character wins which category, and then at the end I'm going to have a fight animation, which is a fairly short one, as I already mentioned earlier. It's actually one of the shortest fight animations I've ever done, so don't expect an over-the-top spectacle, because realistically these two wouldn't be fighting for very long due to the both stamina caps of both of them, and also just logically, whichever one gets the good hit in first is most likely winning. And that wouldn't take very long. It'd be like a real-life sword duel where it typically ended in a couple seconds. It's a little longer in a couple seconds, but it's still nothing close to as long as something like the Giga vs. Ramorak monster face-off that Goji Center did. Meaning they're not dragging this out into a slugfest. It's ending pretty quickly after they meet each other. But what I'm going to do is essentially like that battle face-off, break down who wins what category, move on to the animation, and then at the very end I'll have a ending part where I just basically say why it went one way over the other. And that's pretty much going to be the video. So with that little explanation out the way, I'm going to go ahead and get into it. Starting off with the first category, size. When it comes to size, it's a little confusing, as typically you would just go by weight, but for this, the weight's a little weird. Because Samson weighs more than he most likely should, at around 75 metric tons, at my estimate at least, which would, that's a lot. Whereas Tiamatosaurus, who is larger in volume and length and height and all that, is only around 60 metric tons. They're both colossal, and the difference is only 20%, but that's still odd that the far shorter creature is that much heavier than the far larger looking creature. The most likely explanation for this would be that Tiamatosaurus is more dinosaurian than mammalian, so he's more bird/reptile than mammal. Also, he's far less armored. Most of his armor comes from his arapaima-like scales, which cover his entire body. He doesn't have thick plating or massive ram-like horns on his head, which likely contribute a lot to Samson's weight. And also, it's potentially true that his bones would be a little thinner due to his body structure not needing as thick of bones in certain areas. And also the fact that his bones would be somewhat similar to birds, but not quite like hollow, because obviously it would be able to hold up 60 metric tons if that was the case. But still, when it comes to size, I'm going to give it to Samson because he is the heavier of the two in just sheer mass. However, when it comes to stuff like height and like length and all that, it would go to Tiamatosaurus, as he is larger in those areas. One category that is a far more clear winner, though, is physical strength. Now, on paper, you could give this to either one if you didn't really think about it for too long. On one hand, Samson is the heavier of the two, and he's also built for pretty much the sole purpose of bullying other creatures with just size and physical strength. When you look at Tiamatosaurus, though, compared to Samson, you could argue he's the stronger of the two due to having far larger limbs, particularly arms. Also, his cannon feat of overpowering the Mosasaurus. But what I think really determines the winner here is ignoring all their feats. Obviously, we have Samson defeating 3 Indom 2.0s at the cost of his life. And also, Tiamatosaurus being outright confirmed to be far stronger than Loricodon, who could literally lift Rexy up and ragdoll her around like she was a toy. And obviously Umbreodon, who could do the same thing to the Indom, basically, just less overpowering her physically, more biting her with the force of like a trillion tasers. Tiamatosaurus simply would have a better build for physical strength. You could make the argument that Samson is physically stronger when it comes to pushing or lifting stuff, due to the fact he's essentially built like a massive forklift. But at the same time, Tiamatosaurus has arms that have bonobo DNA in them, as well as Thesiosaurus DNA for the claws. Eventually, these arms are strong enough that he can support his weight while knuckle walking, which is probably not very realistic, but then again, neither are either of these two. I mean, the only things that got to these weights in real life were sauropods, and they had bodies designed to get to that weight, whereas neither of these two really have bodies specialized for that weight in the same way. But ignoring that there's probably a good chance that if these things were real, they'd like instantly collapse in on themselves due to sheer size. Tiamatosaurus is simply built better for striking strength and raw physical power in his limbs. His arms are almost as long as Samson is, not counting the tail. And I mean, like, if you were to have 4 legs that were like the size of like a pencil, I mean, then you were to go up against a guy who has 2 back legs the size of something like a crown, and then he was to have 2 front legs the size of something like a ruler. What do you think's hitting harder, the pencil or the ruler? Probably the ruler. That's just due to the size alone. This is ignoring the fact that these things are specialized like chimp arms and have claws that are like almost as long as around half of Samson's tusk. Like, he's not beating that in terms of just sheer striking power. So when it comes to raw physical strength, I think Tiamatosaurus takes it fairly easily. Next we have intelligence, which again has a pretty debatable winner, for me at least, as although Samson shows far better feats of intelligence so far, as at least he shows some pretty high thinking throughout the few appearances he has, and obviously other members of his species show pretty decent intelligence. Tiamatosaurus has a better DNA makeup to be smarter, and he's also been around far smarter things than Samson, like Umbreodon, who can literally write English better than the average human could, And Loricodon, who's arguably smarter than he is and is smart enough to understand human languages fairly easily. Obviously, she can't talk because her mouth is like if you had a saber-toothed tiger and a T-Rex had a baby. Obviously, a mouth like that isn't going to be able to form words. But Tiamatosaurus was still able to at least somewhat understand and communicate with these two throughout its entire life as they were raised together. As kind of like siblings, even though none of them were really that similar. I guess Loricodon and Tiamatosaurus are fairly similar to some degree, at least in general build and general idea of what they are. But yeah, Tiamatosaurus was definitely the dumbest out of the three, even being considered somewhat stupid in comparison, according to the engine scientist that made him. He isn't dumb by animal standards at all. He has Leviathan DNA, which was a fairly decently smart ancient whale, very similar to the modern day sperm whale, which is also very intelligent. It has Bonobo DNA, which is like if you had a chimp become smarter, slimmer, and less murdery. And he also has human DNA in his brain. Not as much as the other ones, obviously, but still enough to give him some level of basic human intelligence. Something Samson wouldn't really have answer to. Samson doesn't have DNA of dumb animals solely, though. He's still pretty smart, as he has blue whale DNA, as well as, obviously, Paleoloxodon DNA, which we can assume was at least around an actual elephant, if not a little smarter, a little dumber, but around a modern-day elephant, or potentially a woolly mammoth in intelligence. Elephants are very smart animals, and so is pretty much every species of marine mammal that's similar to a whale, like dolphins, for instance. But you're looking at a creature that has two very smart primates, arguably the two smartest primates, as well as a very smart whale versus a guy that has one very smart mammal and one decently smart whale. Obviously, the one that has two of the smartest animals to ever exist is going to end up winning the intelligence battle. That's not to say Samson isn't smart enough to keep up with him. It's just saying that Tiamatosaurus is probably on a basic level smarter than Samson. They're both still not the smartest hybrids around. That crown would most likely go to either Primatus rex or Umbreodon or potentially Loricodon. But yeah, probably Primatus rex actually. He talks pretty fluent English. He knows how to taunt people, but I barely really even count him at this point because they don't really go in depth on his genome other than kaiju and a couple human ancestors. But ignoring that, yeah, I think Tiamatosaurus is the smarter of the two just due to the DNA he has in his system. And now we get to speed. This one has probably the clearest winner out of them all so far. I don't think I really had to explain too much. One is literally a slower elephant that's only really fast when charging, which, to be fair, it's surprisingly fast in a charge. The other one is a creature that, although rare, it would rarely resort to this, will actually chase down prey and can do so fairly efficiently. It's also made out of a lot of fairly fast animals despite its size. And although chasing is something it wouldn't normally do unless it had to, in a fight situation that's life or death, it's more than willing to waste a couple calories and have to make them up later if it means actually surviving the encounter. So when it comes to speed, I don't think I have to really go in depth as to how fast each of these two are. It should be fairly obvious off builds alone that Tiamatosaurus would be the faster of the two when running, which he can do. There's also the fact that he can stand bipedally for short periods and can even move bipedally, and also possesses the ability to jump very short distances. Although, even though it's a very short distance, I don't think anyone's going to argue that Samson could jump at all. Whereas Tiamatosaurus can, it's just not something he likes doing because obviously that's not good for a creature of that size to try to do. Still something he is capable of doing though. So for speed, Tiamatosaurus would take this fairly easy. On to probably the most debatable out of all the categories for this, auxiliary weapons, or aux weapons for short. What this basically is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's just the weapons that these guys have access to, as in biological weapons, claws, tusks, horns, all that. For Tiamatosaurus, obviously he has a pretty big and very dangerous set of jaws, mostly based around the Giga and Tyrannosaurus, the Jurassic World versions of both, that being Rexy and Zeb, respectively. And then also having some traits of the Mosasaur, a little bit of the Spinosaur DNA mixed in there as well, and obviously the Leviathan to give it the giant, almost whale-like size. So with all that combined in a way that tries to maintain some level of stability while still very obviously being kind of unnatural for a creature, we get a pretty decently overpowered set of jaws, made even more dangerous by the sheer size of the creature and also the massive teeth that it has access to. On its arms, it has massive Thesiosaurus-based claws, which are, I don't think I have to explain how dangerous those are. We all saw what it did to a Giga in Jurassic World Dominion. It would do even worse to something like a giant elephant that has exposed areas. So, like, obviously, if he lands a decently good hit with those claws on the exposed underbelly of Samson, it would be pretty much a game over right there. These things are more than long enough to hit vital areas. His tail can also be used as a weapon, with him using it in a similar way to how an Arapaima would use its actual body to inflict damage. And due to the sheer size of it, and also how durable the scales and thick muscle underneath are that this guy has, he's going to hit very hard with it. Obviously not as hard as something like Samson's tusk, but it would still be enough to at least stun something like Samson, and it potentially even kill smaller creatures like a T-Rex or a Indominus. His legs, though far smaller than his arms, can still be used to kick or still pretty badly injure an enemy. It's not like he's incapable of using them in combat. He would just typically not, because it's one of the less effective weapons he has access to. But Samson isn't exactly lacking in the auxiliary weapons department either. He just has most of them focused towards his head and not spread around his body. With the only one that isn't really focused on his head, if you don't count his clawed feet, which don't really matter here, because yeah, they can inflict damage, but these claws are also like not even 1/10 the size of the claws that are on his opponent's hands, which he can obviously still use if he's knocked to the ground. So like, yeah, they're dangerous, but it's like bringing a pocket knife to a sword fight. It's not going to go well. However, the only other weapon that's off his head that would be potentially useful here would be his tail club, but then again, due to the size of that and the size of his opponent, it could stun him, I guess. But if Tiamatosaurus gets behind Samson, I think he's going to have some pretty big issues, even with the tail swinging rapidly. I mean, Tiamatosaurus could probably rip the tail off with his jaws, so that leaves the weapons focused on his head, which include massive Paleoloxodon-based tusks, which are obviously a problem. They're huge. They're even bigger than the claws that would, for most opponents, be the biggest weapon they've ever seen on a creature. Yeah, no, these tusks dwarf those. He also has massive ram-like horns, which, although he's probably not going to be trying to gut people with these, or trying to gut his opponent with them, he could still headbutt Tiamatosaurus with them, and it would be a major problem. These also add into the just sheer weight and power of his head. I mean, if he was to ram him, there'd be issues. And his trunk is also a fairly decent weapon, although I will say using a trunk against an opponent with teeth like that and a jaw set like that is probably not a great idea, because he could bite down on it, and unless he gets him good with the tusks very quickly, he's probably going to lose it. So overall, I think they're fairly even for the most part. I think Tiamatosaurus has more useful weapons for this fight, but I think that his weapons have one major weakness here. They don't really allow him to play defensive well, unless he was to continuously back away, but I don't think Samson would be dumb enough to try to chase after something like this. He'd probably try to stay his ground and play defensive, which he has all the tools to do. So long as he keeps Tiamatosaurus in front of him and continues to try to keep his tusk and horns pointed towards Tiamatosaurus, it'd be hard for Tiamatosaurus to actually do anything. Of course, Samson could also play aggressive, and he could do so fairly well, but tiring himself out by trying to follow Tiamatosaurus if he was retreating would be a dumb idea. That said, I don't think Tiamatosaurus would want to retreat if he's getting attacked, or if he was doing the attacking. So overall, I think it's fairly even, depending on how these two fight. If they both go for the offensive, I think it's probably going to go in Tiamatosaurus' favor for the most part. However, if they're both trying to play defensive, this could easily go in Samson's favor. And if they both do a bit of both, it's honestly a 50-50 for who uses their weapons more effectively. So for this one, I'm going to call it a tie. There are definitely arguments for either side winning, as obviously Samson has the bigger weapons of the two in terms of like lethalness. And the arms on Tiamatosaurus are, I mean, they're pretty overpowered. So you could argue either side winning here, but I'm just going to make it easy and call it a tie. Now for an odd category that might surprise you, I'm calling this Familiarity. Now, familiarity doesn't mean how familiar we are with these guys, it means how familiar they would be with their opponents. Obviously, having experience with opponents similar to the one you're going up against is going to help you to find out a strategy against it. And thankfully for both these guys, they have fought something vaguely similar, but not so similar it would give them a super big edge, but still giving each of them at least some idea of what to try to do here. For Tiamatosaurus, the closest thing he's fought to Samson would be stuff like a Triceratops. While still very different from Samson in a lot of ways, it's still similar enough to where he'd have an idea of what to do. And as for the tail club, he has killed Ankylosaurus before, so he knows what that is, and he knows to avoid it, or rip it off if he has to. As for Samson, Tiamatosaurus is vaguely similar in build to the Indom 2.0, just far larger obviously, and a lot less aggressive, and there's also only one of him, not an army. So the way that Samson would probably approach it is in a similar way to how he'd try to approach fighting an Indom 2.0, just a lot more cautious and probably a lot less confident. He'd try to play it a lot safer than he normally would, or potentially try to end it a lot quicker than he normally would. Because what he's going to view it as is a way bigger, way stronger variant of the things he's been fighting for potentially years. Assuming this is a version of Samson that survives longer than the actual canon one did. So, with that said, both of these guys are going to tie here. They both have a basic idea of what to do to the opponent, but then again, the things they're going to compare the opponent to are still very different from their actual opponent. Now on to a potentially debatable one, we have durability. This one's weird because one of them has far stronger armor, but the other one has a lot more armor, and it covers basically everything. Looking at Tiamatosaurus, he's armored everywhere. He has basically borderline, he has pretty much bulletproof scales everywhere on his body. Scales based heavily on the arapaima and scaled up to his size, plus the thick muscle under, and a hide under his scales to boot. That would be obviously extremely thick due to just his size alone. He's an extremely durable guy. His only weak spot would be a sail, but then again, the Spino he took DNA from isn't like the real life one. A real life one falling its sail would potentially be lethal for it, at the very least be extremely dangerous for it. And most likely it's gonna maybe not critically injure it, but it's gonna hurt it. Whereas the one that we see in Camp Cretaceous and in Jurassic Park 3 gets thrown on the sail all the time and just gets back up. So it's safe to say that he can get thrown on the sail and get back up without it being a pretty much game-ending fight right there, like it would be with an actual real-life Spinosaur. But regardless, even though he does have a lot more armor, it's not as thick or durable as the shell and horns and tusk and all that stuff that we see on Samson. Although the horns technically count as weapons, they also kind of double as armor. They're essentially a giant bony helmet. Well, not really. Yeah, I guess kind of. It's essentially having a massive helmet on his head. Like, it's going to make damaging his ears and like the top of his head extremely difficult. Plus, his shell covers a lot of his body, with his only exposed areas being some of his legs and some of his underbelly, as well as stuff like his neck and I guess his face to a degree. But then again, that's where the tusk and trunk and horns are, so you might not want to aim for that. Regardless, I think this one's also a tie. Now, before someone gets real mad in the comic section, the way I'm going to explain why this is a tie is pretty simple. Yeah, Tiamatosaurus has weaker armor, but he could get hit on his underbelly and potentially survive. Whereas Samson gets clawed there, he's downed and he's probably dead. But if Samson was to land a dangerous hit on the upper part of Tiamatosaurus, there's a good chance he could kill him, whereas Tiamatosaurus was to land a good hit on the upper part of Samson, his claws are probably bouncing off. What I'm saying is both of them have armor that kind of has its own pros and cons, and the pros and cons are relatively even for the most part. As Samson is hard to get under, and odds are Samson, who is significantly shorter than Tiamatosaurus, isn't hitting his quote-unquote weak spot very easily. So they're pretty much tied here. Now, originally I was going to include senses and also personality as extra categories here, but the reason I'm not is for senses. Both of these would smell the other one fairly quickly, and both of them have pretty decent eyesight. So, like, even though there would obviously be one with slightly better senses, these guys aren't fighting in, like, the fog or anything, so they're not really going to need to have extremely broken senses to pinpoint the other one, and by the time the fight starts, that hardly matters anymore. And for personality, both of these guys, for the most part, are pretty docile, even though, obviously, Samson's not going to like seeing a super mega predator just walking around, and Tiamatosaurus seeing a herbivore of this size, one of the probably the only creature he's seen at this point to rival him in just sheer size. He's probably not going to make him a very happy guy. But the reason I didn't really include personality is their personalities aren't too different for a carnivore and herbivore, at least. Tiamatosaurus typically isn't going out of his way to pick fights, unlike Umbreodon or Loricodon. And Samson's really just minding his own business, eating, typically with his herd, but for this fight it's a 1v1. Obviously it was a herd, I don't think there'd be much of a debate here. Tiamatosaurus would just get swarmed and would probably die unless he retreated, which he could probably do due to how much faster he is than these guys. But yeah, with all that out of the way, we'll go ahead and show how I think this fight would most likely go. Remember, the animation isn't meant to be hyper-realistic. The only thing that's meant to be realistic is the winner here. The animation was just me having fun animating two things fighting, even though I do think the fight would be fairly quick like this animation. And there you have it. So why does Samson lose here? And to put it bluntly, he's not really built for this fight. Although it is a close match on paper, and I did think it was a lot closer than it was by the time I was done with this video, it isn't as close as I thought. It's still close in the fact that either the two could win under certain circumstances, but it's not close in the fact that one of them is better set up to win on average. Looking at Samson, his best way to win would be playing defensive and hoping that Tiamatosaurus just messes up, which, as Tiamatosaurus is not always smarter but faster and more likely to be able to dodge an attack from a far slower and littler opponent, the odds of that actually happening are fairly slim. Whereas you look at how Tiamatosaurus would win, all he'd have to do is wear down Samson through repeated brutal attacks and eventually get a weak spot or start disarming him, which he could do a lot easier. He also wouldn't have to hope for the opponent to do something, he would just do it himself. Though yes, Samson would be a pretty big threat to Tiamatosaurus and could kill him. Let's not say that I did say that. He could absolutely kill Tiamatosaurus in a fight if he got the chance. Tiamatosaurus was just better built for taking down an opponent like Samson. His arms are pretty much tailor-made for bringing things his size down, even though he typically wouldn't even fight something his size. His jaws are pretty much as big as the entire head of Samson. He could fit most of that guy's head in his mouth. He could also bite onto a tusk and pretty much overpower him from there. Even if Samson did try to overpower him, both arms are probably overpowering one head, even with the slight weight advantage that Samson has over him, which is most likely due to stuff that isn't sheer muscle mass, as if you look at the two, it's more likely that Tiamatosaurus is actually the more muscular and overall stronger of the two physically, as I already explained earlier. There's also the matter of how these two would realistically fight if they met. Yeah, we could argue that Samson would play defensive, and he probably would for a while, but Samson's gonna eventually have to start playing offensive. He can't afford to let himself get wear down. He can't afford to sit there for too long, because if he does, he's going to start tiring out through repeatedly blocking attacks from an opponent like this. Whereas Tiamatosaurus doesn't have to worry about expending too much energy, because that's kind of how he hunts regardless. Though yeah, when he's typically on a normal day, he's not going to be hunting something his size. If he was to fight another hybrid, he would start chasing it down, and he would start fighting and hunting like a predator would. He's fighting Samson with the full mindset of, I'm going to kill this thing and I'm going to eat it. Whereas Samson's fighting this thing thinking this thing's a threat to me and my herd and I need to kill it. Or at the very least, survive this fight and get more of my kind to go kill it. But Samson has no way of running away. Whereas if it really came down to it, Tiamatosaurus could leave for like 3 minutes, come back while Samson's retreating and just ambush him. There's also the fact that Tiamatosaurus could use weapons if he found something. He does have opposable thumbs, even though the model lacks them. That's because I forgot. The same thing happened with Umbreodon. In fact, I think the only one of the three that actually has opposable thumbs right now is Loricodon, because somehow my brain just doesn't want to work sometimes. Regardless, he does have thumbs and primate-like hands, so he could realistically use a weapon if he had to. Something that even lesser creatures like the Indom 2.0 could use to lethal offense against Samson, according to Madly Mesozoic himself. So there's that as well. There's also, pretty simply put, I think Tiamatosaurus has better stamina than Samson. If you look at the two elephants, though they have a decent stamina due to the way they live and also their diets and all that, these guys aren't like running like massive amount. They aren't running like they're not moving fast. They aren't doing much like that. Whereas if you look at similar sized creatures that are carnivores, actually carnivore that he has DNA from, like the T-Rex, it can move fairly fast for a fairly decent amount of time, and was definitely it had more endurance than an elephant. I don't think anyone's going to argue the elephant has more stamina than a T-Rex does. So off that alone, yeah, Tiamatosaurus most likely had more stamina, and he also just had a better range of weapons to take down Samson. Samson would have to use his head only. If Tiamatosaurus got around to the side or back of Samson, Samson had pretty much no way to hurt him other than his tail club, which isn't really big enough to be effective. In fact, Tiamatosaurus' tail is more effective due to the size alone. And also the fact that Tiamatosaurus could probably take getting hit with a tusk at least one time due to the scales on his body everywhere. So yeah, it would probably leave a cut or something, or potentially even break through the scales to a degree. He had a higher chance of surviving that than Samson would have of surviving getting his guts ripped out by massive claws hitting pretty much exposed hide. So overall, I think Tiamatosaurus wins simply because he's just better built to take on an opponent like Samson than Samson is to take on a predator larger than himself. Now, that's not to say that he would win against a group of Samson's species, because he would obviously die, or at the very least have to retreat. However, there's also a similar situation for Samson where he'd be by a riverbank and he'd suddenly get treated like a zebra trying to take a drink out of the Nile River with a bunch of crocodiles around. And by that I mean Tiamatosaurus would drag him in and Samson would be defenseless underwater. So I think more times out of 100 you're going to see Samson lose here. I'd say a solid 75 to potentially 80, 85, maybe even 90% of the time, I think Tiamatosaurus is winning, with there being a couple outliers where you could see Tiamatosaurus mess up or do something dumb and end up getting impaled by a massive tusk and pretty much one-shotted. But yeah, that's how I think this fight would go. And if you guys enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. The next one I'll do is Umbreodon versus Primatus Rex. So you guys can look forward to that one if you want to. Anyways, that's all for today. See you guys.